Well, welcome to another episode of Rimshots with Sean. We're going to do a phone in here, which is always fun. About a month or so ago, I stumbled upon this amazing Facebook group dedicated to the one, the only Hal Blaine, and a lady by the name of Ingrid Fasching, who does an amazing job, is on the line with me. Ingrid, thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Sean. Thank you for inviting me.
So first thing, I mean, the page is incredible. I learn a lot daily. What was your relationship with Hal? I mean, obviously you were in the inner circle, but just the information that you have up and put up there is just incredible.
Well, I won't talk too much about that because I don't want to make it about me. But I know a lot of things about him from different people, and obviously from correspondence and things like that. And I do some research on some things I don't know, read articles, like older newspaper articles and things like that to gather information from him, and also from a lot of his relatives also I talk to.
So, you're really, you're I guess, keeping a documented history of Hal and his career and who he was, and there's some funny tidbits and things that you share, but What would you say to people that haven't seen it? Describe Hal, I guess, in a few sentences or less.
Well, basically, what it does is it gives you a lot of Hal's history, starting out from practically when he was born to his passing in 2019. But what I try to do there is I try to give a little bit more than just a history about the music. I like to tell people about what he was like as a person, because that reflects a lot of what you hear in the music, because he was very personal about how he approached the music. He actually wrote 80 or 90% of his own parts for everything, and when he did play something, he played it based on what he felt from the music. He would hear, like, the singer would just sing a scratch version of it for him, and then he would sit down and he would pen what he felt inside emotionally for the music. And so what that does is it gives people a little bit more it makes their music more meaningful to them, because it becomes more personalized once they understand the musician that's behind the drums.
So, full disclosure, I'm a drummer myself. I've played for a number of years. I've played professionally. He's always been a guy who, I've always obviously known about. I've always studied. When I saw the Wrecking Crew documentary, I mean, his personality just came through in that piece, obviously. I guess his start, I mean, there's so many songs, and you go through it, and you confirm or no, he played in this, he didn't play on that. But off the top of your head, how many, I guess, compositions did he record on?
He recorded close to 6,000. He documented something like 5,600 and some odd number. And there were a lot of them that I found since he passed that I do have proof that he recorded on, that he just didn't get to documenting. And he did all the documentation from contracts. So it's what he came up with is actually the truth, and not like, oh, I think I played on this, I'm just going to write it down.
He seems to be a gentleman who, documented what he did very carefully. I mean, and not everybody has that skill set, but, for him, and you describe him kind of going into the studio and sitting around sometimes waiting for sessions to happen and not wanting to leave because he felt he might be called on at any given time. Just to be able to do that in a career that he had is incredible. Do you sometimes find it overwhelming when you're going through it all?
Well, I'll tell you about Hal. He was very meticulous in organization and also keeping track of things. Now, part of that was because sometimes the record companies would kind of try to short them and things like that. But he was, just as a person, that's just the way he was. He was very organized. I've shown pictures of parts of his home on there and how he had it decorated with his different mementos. I mean, he was just a very organized person. But the other thing about Hal was that he was a very responsible person, and he was always wanting to do the right thing. And that wasn't for any nefarious reason or anything like that, or like he might get something out of it. That's just the way he was. He's a very rare person, and that he was a very good person, and it was all authentic. I mean, he was a very kind, caring, thoughtful person.
So you look at his career, and obviously it spanned, decades, and you're very quick to point out, or you're quick to, go into some detail about, the rise, and then I guess his later years. But when he was in the thick of things, I mean, he was really, he would have paved the way for the guys like the Jeff Piccaros and some of the studio players of, the 70s and 80s. And did he ever get a sense of, I guess, where his place was in history in terms of all those records and all those things that he played on?
He said while he was in the midst of it, he didn't, because he was so busy that he practically just lived in the studio. And to him, like the other musicians, were sort of family to him. And the other musicians spent a lot of time too, but not as much as Hal. I mean, he was pretty deep into it. He was there from like early in the morning till like 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. Then he would go home and he would type up contracts when he was the contractor for sessions. But at the time, he said he really didn't, because he was so busy. He said a lot of it he couldn't even remember. To quote him, he said it was like a blizzard, like a snowstorm. So it didn't really hit him till later. I mean, obviously, yeah, when a record became a hit, he noticed at that time. But I don't think he really realized the gravity of what they were doing. And in fact, he and both Don Randy, who was a session player that played the piano, in case anybody doesn't know that, they both said that they wished they sort of would have paid more attention. But at the time, they didn't realize what a historical time it was in music.
Well, and it's funny, and I'll get into some of the funny stories that you tell maybe in our next segment. But when you have a part of, I guess, a piece on there, and I'll ask you: Are you the sole moderator of that page? Is it pretty much you mining through everything and answering all the questions and taking care of everything?
Well, I'll tell you, it was actually started by another gentleman, and I believe he's from South America. And when I went onto the page, I was going to start writing a book about Hal. And so I went on the page just to kind of get a feel for what was going on there. Well, when I went on it, and this is not anything to say about the previous administrator of the page, there were only like 2,000 people there. I think not even that. And there really wasn't anything going on. And I thought, well, I'm going to start posting some things here. And to answer your question, eventually I asked the original administrator if I could be administrator, because I was going to do a fundraiser for a star in Palm Springs for Hal, and I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to post on things that I wanted to once I was administrator. Well, anyway, so he and I are both administrators on it. And then I have another gentleman who is the moderator, and that gentleman, which is really kind of interesting, he's actually Joe Osborne's brother-in-law.
Wow.
So we kind of make a joke that we're Hal and Joe part 2, on there.
Well, it's interesting because I know the heavy lifting, because I mean my page, I have upwards of 10,000-12,000 people on it and different sorts of things, and it's sometimes very difficult to keep everybody, I guess, in a positive mood, right? Like you post something and somebody wants to interject their opinions on things, but for the most part, you've been able to keep that page fairly you've been able to keep it positive. I've yet to see anything where somebody has to be threatened to be kicked out or whatever. You did have a poster maybe last week that you'll start blocking people if they're doing inappropriate things. But what do you attribute that to?
Well, basically, the way I try to run that page is I try to run it in the spirit of how Hal was in life, and that is being a nice person, being gracious, being kind, treating people with respect and dignity. And so that's the way I try to run that page. And I think also showing people examples of the way that Hal lived his life and that he was a good person. He was a decent person. He had really good values. I've never heard anybody say anything bad about him. And I think it has an effect on people.
It is,
and I think maybe also people are kind of longing for that in a way, a little bit of decency.
I'd agree with that.
Usually, in general, I mean, I've only had a handful of people that I had to kick off of there that maybe called me a bad name or something, or tried to, I tend to be try to be lenient with people on there and understanding. And sometimes I might message people behind the scenes and just say, hey, try not to say that to other people. If somebody starts attacking somebody else and calling them, like a 4-letter word or something.
For
and
sure.
I might message them and say, hey, just kind of cool it.
So Ingrid, look, we're gonna take a quick break here.
Like Hal was.
No, for sure. We're going to take a quick break here. We're just getting started because there's a few things that I wanted to I'm funny. I never commit anything to paper. It's always in my mind, but there's a few things that I want to ask you. So if you can just stick around, we'll be back right after this. Well, welcome back to Rimshots with Sean. I am here with Ingrid Fasching, and are you in Palm Springs?
No, I'm not. I'd rather not say where I live, just for internet safety and stuff. But no, I'm not in Palm Springs.
Totally fine, and I understand because people can be funny like that.
Oh yeah.
So the one thing that I remember seeing that Wrecking Crew movie, and there was different sort of shots with Hal and Hal Blaine. Obviously, we're talking about, and the man had these piercing blue eyes. I mean, it was just like. And when he talked, he seemed to intently listen to the question, and then he would kind of light up when he was giving his answer. Was that his personality in a nutshell?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, he was a very positive, very up individual. He was like any of us. He would have his bad days and get down. I mean, he's a human being. But in general, I mean, he very much enjoyed comedy. That was his second love next to music. And so he was always trying to crack jokes. He loved telling people stories. He generally loved to make other people feel good and feel inspired. And he was always trying to help people. And he was very much a giver. He was a giver in his music, and he was a giver outside of music. I mean, he would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. I've heard, he gave clothes to homeless people. One time he was in Pink's Hot Dogs. I'll give you a little story here. And a bunch of young kids came in, and there were like 12 of them, and they couldn't afford the hot dogs. And Hal went up there, and he paid for their hot dogs. And there was a friend with him, and the friend said, why did you do that? How can you do that? And Hal said, one of these days you'll understand about unconditional giving. And that's the way he was. I mean, I could give you plenty of stories about Hal giving money to people and stuff like that, or doing things for people. He would, after he retired, he spent a lot of time, he loved corresponding with people. He would talk to people on the phone. Now, of course, he would, within reason. He didn't want to be bombarded with it, and he would just send people little gifts. Either he'd send them like a pair of drumsticks or a signed picture. He would send people Christmas cards or anniversary cards or birthday cards. He was very much a caring person. He had really very little ego. Of course, he loved when he would get accolades and things like that. And he was really, really humble. I mean, anytime if you tried to say something about, wow, this is really great that you did or whatever. Here's another story right now. Frank DeVito was another gentleman that did some session work. He's basically a jazz drummer. Probably your listeners will be familiar with him. Very nice man. Anyway, one time he and Hal were in an interview, and he started talking about how he went up to Hal one time when he played something really spectacular and said, that was really great what you did on that record. And Hal said, you can do it. Anybody can do it. I mean, that's just the way he was. He was very humble, just an extremely unusual person in that sense, that he did so much in life, but yet he just thought it was just his job. In fact, he said he was no different than somebody in the General Electric refrigerator plant putting refrigerator doors on a refrigerator. That's what he looked at his job.
You had a post, and it had something to do with one of the Beach Boys recordings that he played on, and a friend of mine sent me a clip, and it was a YouTube clip of him in the studio. I think it was when they were doing Pet Sounds, and the thing that I got was, there's Brian Wilson going around trying to get everybody to get their performance. And I'm not going to say he's right in Hal's face, but there was no 6 feet of distancing. He telling him exactly what he wanted. And I got a sense of patience. I got a sense of he listened. I get a sense of he tried to make the artist that he was working with happy. No impatience. And that to me was incredible, because everybody knows when you're in a studio it can be extremely stressful, especially if you're being asked to kind of pivot and do some things on a minute by minute basis. Would that be maybe part of his personality that he was as a human?
Well, he always tried to help people. I have a friend that recorded with him back in the 70s, and he said that when he walked in there, Hal was the first one to walk over to him and shake his hand and welcome him into the studio, and was willing to help him with anything. I mean, he had absolutely no ego about him. And, I'll tell you just a couple things. He said that the most important thing that he learned was to be cordial to people. He used to call himself a simpatico person, which, if people don't know, that means somebody that gets along well with others.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way he kind of self-described himself, and that's the way he was. And he understood that he was just in there to play the drums, that the producers and the artists ultimately were the bosses, so to say, and what they wanted to do, he would do, even if it might be something he didn't agree with. Now, there would be times that he would speak up and say, he would say it this way, like, I don't mean to cause any problems, but I think maybe if we did this might be better than this, or whatever. He would suggest things like that, but he was very easygoing, easy to get along with, and he didn't throw a fit like, oh, I don't want to play this piece of music, this is garbage. He would play it. I mean, he knew that was his job, and with Brian Wilson, that's a whole nother book we can get into here, but he had a very special relationship with Brian. Brian, in a way, was he said Brian was a follower. See, Brian had suffered some abuse from his father, and I don't want to get into that, but his father was a very hard person to get along with, and initially he was in the studio trying to boss Brian around, because Murray had a record that he got recorded with Lawrence Welk, and so he thought he knew all about the recording business. Well, so he tried to get Brian to record like he did, and finally, and Hal saw this first stand, how he was abusing Brian. Finally, Brian kicked him out. Well, Hal said Brian was he was a follower, and he leaned on Hal sort of like as a big brother, and Hal enjoyed being sort of mentor for Brian. And I'm not trying to take away from Brian. Brian was a genius, but I mean, there were certain aspects where Brian needed that. He said Brian would always come to him, and he wanted his approval for everything. He would have Hal listen to playbacks, and he'd say, Hal, what do you think of this? Is it okay? And he was always looking for Hal's approval. Brian would set up his piano where he was right at the right side of Hal. And he would play things and kind of look over and ask Hal what he thought. And they would go back and forth, because sometimes Brian would ask Hal to do things. Like, for instance, at the beginning of Good Vibration, there's like an explosive snare sound. Well, that was Brian's doing. He asked Hal to do that. But they kind of were just back and forth and everything. But Hal was really, Brian would go over to Hal's house and sit at his piano and have Hal's little daughter on his knee and bounce her up and down. They had a very, very close relationship. not like they would go out and, have a hot dog together or whatever like that, but I mean, just closer than a lot of the artists that he worked with. But getting back to your initial thing, yes, Hal was he was very willing to do whatever anybody wanted, unless, of course, like I said, he saw where maybe something could be approved. And that's when he said he would speak up, only if he thought something could be better. Like, for instance, with Karen Carpenter, I'll just tell you that. Do you have time to listen to this? Like, I know I'm going on and on.
No, this is great.
Like Karen Carpenter, her mother was kind of like, Hal called her the Bella Basta, where she was like the head of the whole family, and kind of ruled, everything. And she told Hal that Richard this is verbatim what Hal said. Richard is the star. Karen is just the drummer. Okay, that's how she perceived Karen. And I won't go into too much of that. But anyway, when they first went into the studio, her mother, her name was Agnes, insisted that Karen play the drums. Well, Herb Alpert they were going to get dropped by A&M Records because their music just wasn't selling. And so Herb Alpert went to Agnes, Mrs. Carpenter, and suggested they try Hal on drums because he'd been on his, Taste of Honey record and things like that. But I guess they had a heck of a time convincing her, and Herb Alpert had to put on the complete sweetness and everything. And finally she relented and let Hal, play on the drums at the recordings. But another thing that happened was when they went to record We've Only Just Begun, Karen was singing it like at a very high key. And Hal said, I don't mean to cause any problems here, but it's just too high. She's singing too high. And Mrs. Carpenter was like, no, that's just fine. That's the way she rehearsed it. That's just fine. And Hal said, I'm telling you, it's just too high. She should drop down a few notches. And Karen even spoke up and said, yes, it's just too high. But maybe it was straining her voice or something. Anyway, so Mrs. Carpenter relented, and Karen lowered the key, and the voice of Karen Carpenter was born. So in a way, Hal had a hand in Karen's voice, being ultimately what you heard on the record.
And stuff like
That's
that.
the type of thing he would do. That's an example of how he would make suggestions. He never quite tried to rock the boat, but he was always looking for making a hit record. And he had a knack. He should have probably been a producer. And one time we did try to do that, but it was too much. Because he had an ear for what the public would want to hear. And so when he made a suggestion, it was always something to improve the recording, not because of, I want to do it this way.
Well, and let's call it what it is, Ingrid. I mean, he was part of probably some of the biggest, most distinguished songs in the history of music. So, I mean, he probably learned a thing or two. Fair statement?
I'm sorry?
I say he was part of some of the, the biggest all-time hits that were ever, in the history of music. So he definitely would have learned something that he would have been able to impart some of that wisdom and some of that feedback to some of the artists that he was working with.
Absolutely, yes. And, when he got into the studio, he was already in his 30s. So he had a lot of, previous experience, not necessarily in the studios, but, in working in music. And see, the thing about Hal, here's what he did with his life that he said influenced him. Okay, first of all, when he was a very young child, his father would take him to work, and he would take him to what was called the State Theater in Hartford, Connecticut, which was across the street from where his father worked. And while his father was at work, Hal would be at the State Theater. And he got to watch all the big bands, all the different vaudeville acts, singers, dancers, comedians, et cetera, et cetera. He got to watch Buddy Rich. He got to watch Gene Krupa on stage. And he saw that and he wanted to be a drummer. Well, the other thing, too, is when he went to high school, they would have field trips, and they would take the kids to ballets, operas, and also at that time they had live radio shows. And that's the important thing. Hal got hooked on listening to what are called Foley artists. These are the people that make the sounds, like on radio, television, blah, blah, blah. You know, on live radio, he said, like, the Foley artist could take, like, a cigarette wrapper and crunch it and make it sound exactly like there was a fire through the radio. And so that fascinated Hal. Hal had always been fascinated by sounds, and he had an ear for that. That was really what his forte was to start his drumming, was he had an ear for sounds. And so he took all that. In addition, Hal worked for a while as an actor in the early 60s. He just did big parts, and he one time was the double for Salminio in a movie.
Oh, wow.
But in this particular movie with Salminio, there was also Yul Brynner. Well, Yul Brynner was a method actor. Hal saw that Yul Brynner would go into a scene and say, "What is my motivation?" And Hal said, I can apply that to music. I can listen to a song and say, what is my motivation? What is this song saying? What are the lyrics saying? Is the person crying? Are they happy? Are they sad? And then what he would play reflected what he felt from the motivation of that music. So he used to call himself a method drummer, like method acting, but he called himself a method drummer. Well, putting this all together, the sound effects that he heard as a high school student, he also applied them when he got into the studios. And that's why he did things like use orange juice bottles on some of the Beach Boys songs. One time he had recorded the song Houston with Dean Martin. And he was, at the time, Hal smoked at that time. He said everybody smoked. But anyway, he was putting out his ashtray and it went clink. And he said, that's interesting. That sounds just like somebody driving in spikes on a railroad. And so he went to the producer and said, I'd like to do an overdub. So he took his ashtray and one of his metal mallets, and he overdubbed that into the song Houston. And as you listen to it, you could hear like somebody hitting a railroad spike, and that's Hal's ashtray. He was very good at finding just simple things, or things that he even invented, to make sounds on recordings. So he didn't just drum, he also used his mind. He was very creative, very inventive, and a very intelligent man. And he used his mind to add things to songs. Like, for instance, he used his tire chains on Bridge Over Troubled Water, because in his mind, he said he envisioned there being a chain gang of slaves when he heard that song. And so he went out to his car and he got his car chains and overdubbed them onto that song. Just things like that. I could go on and on, but that's just the things that he added that made what he did even more special, and also how he operated, being a method drummer and also by sounds.
I love that. Method drummer is, I've never heard that term before, other than, I guess, applied to him.
He called himself, many times he called himself a method drummer.
That's incredible. Look, you're busy. I know you're busy. I appreciate your time. I don't want to keep you too long, but one question I guess that I do have, maybe speculation, maybe this is what you know, but if there was one or two songs that, I was sitting with Hal Blaine and I said, what are your, I guess, signature songs that when you hear them you say, yes, those are like the favorite ones that I've ever played on? Would you know what those might be, or could you speculate what those might be?
Sure. No, I can tell you because I know exactly what he said. First of all, the one that was his favorite, which will surprise a lot of people, it was a song by the Fifth Dimension, but it's one that maybe people haven't heard of, and it wasn't a hit record. And it's called Dimension 5.
Huh.
Now, the reason why that was his favorite that he played on was because he got his drumming on it. It was almost completely done with brushes. And he was very proud of the work that he did on that record. And so that was his favorite because of his drum work. Now, the other ones that he liked were MacArthur Park, obviously, Taste of Honey, he didn't really mention Be My Baby, surprisingly enough. Let's see, some of the other Fifth Dimension songs, Up and Away, Up and Away, that was another favorite of his. Bridge Over Troubled Water, and Boxer.
Wow.
Let's see. I mean, he liked everything that he worked on, pretty much. But those were basically the ones he cited most often as his favorites. But like I said, Dimension 5, that was his favorite because of he was so proud of what he had done on that record as far as his drumming.
So I'm sure you covered this. He played on California Dreaming, correct?
That's correct.
And there's a little connection, albeit a long one. But so I'm in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where Denny Doherty actually grew up. And a lot of people, that's a song that's played here all the time just because of the Denny Doherty connection and the fact that, we like to highlight our own, right? And that song to me, maybe not super technically complex, but just what he does with the snare drum, where he doubles up the snare drum in certain parts. I think you coined that. At one point you had a post that it was, the Hal Blaine beat, if you will. Did I read that correctly?
About the California Dreaming, or
well, no, just how he would be playing the snare on like a 2 and a 4, and all of a sudden he would start the backbeat and he'd be going on all fours, and it was just kind of this sound that nobody had heard before, where it was peppy and upbeat, but instead of the snare drum just going on the 2 and the 4, it was the one, it was going through the whole thing and keeping kind of driving the beat.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and I mean, he did a lot of different interesting things with his drums. Like, for instance, he always played behind the beat. And Joe Osborne said he had to learn that when he was working with Hal, because he always had to watch Hal's bass drum foot pedal, because Hal played behind the beat. See, Hal was, he was trained as a jazz drummer. And that's what he did initially, the first 30 years of his life, about the 20 years of him playing drums. And he was actually a jazz drummer. And he actually played with Count Basie once. So he kind of brought a little bit of a swing to when he did the rock recordings, and added a little jazz touch to them. And he did a lot of different things innovative things with his drums, especially the tuning. He was the first one. He actually tuned his drums to the normal speaking voice. He said drums were before that time were tuned really high, and that it just sounded tinny to him. And he felt that everything should be in your normal speaking voice, which is mid-range. So he tuned his drums mid-range, and that's kind of started a new way of tuning for rock drumming. And of course, the beats from Be My Baby, I mean, that boom, 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 bang, I mean, that changed rock drumming completely.
It did, and
so many innovations that it did.
It's so funny, Ingrid, because I, in my personal plan, I always like to joke around that if somebody says, "Hey, where did you get that part from?" and I can name the album and whatever, and it's kind of funny because the people that I was influenced by, I now, and especially since I've been following your page, I sit there and I go, my God, I can't believe how much I was actually influenced by a guy like Hal through other people that I grew up listening to. So it's quite incredible how his pieces are, I think, going to be, we're going to be studying them for hundreds of years. I think. I mean, they're just timeless.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a lot of things that people don't even know about. Like, I know some of his more obscure recordings, and sometimes I like to highlight them there on the site, because it's like, okay, this wasn't a hit record, but listen to his drums, because sometimes some of his best drumming, people have never heard it, because it's on an obscure recording. The other thing about Hal that made him really spectacular was that he could play about any genre. And he always talked about that. He always said that drummers and musicians in general should listen to everything out there, from classical to jazz to ragtime to Dixieland, because he said, and this is what he would always say, it all goes into your computer. That's what he called his brain. He said, and all that stuff goes into your computer and you draw from it later. Like one time he was at a movie date at Universal Pictures, and it was a movie, and the characters were in India somewhere, and the arranger asked him to play some Indian music. Well, Universal Pictures, they had their own music room where they kept their instruments and things like that. They were the only movie place that did that. So Hal went back into their instrument room to look for tablets. Well, they didn't have any. So Hal improvised his drums to make tablets. He loosened the heads on them, and he put like a handkerchief on there. And between using like his hand and his stick, he mimicked tablets. Now, what happened was he was behind the barrier, which is called a Shelley. They called it a Shelley man barrier. So it basically looks like Kilroy's here. We could only see the upper part of somebody's head.
Right.
And so the arranger couldn't see what he was doing back there. So he didn't know he didn't have tablets. And when he was finished, the arranger said, "That was perfect. That was just what I wanted. That was perfect." Oh, before that, he went to Hal and he said, "Hal, don't leave. I need to talk to you." And Hal said, "Oh, Jesus, what did I do?" You know? He thought maybe he screwed up. Well, then the guy went to him and he said, "What I told you, that was just marvelous. That was fantastic. Exactly what we wanted." And here Hal didn't use tablets, but you couldn't tell because he mimicked tablets. And that's what he would do. And that's another thing. Like I said, he listened to everything. And he listened to all sorts of different music. He didn't just stay with one kind of music. And for Hal, his favorite kind of music was big band. And he liked standards and singers. I mean, he was, from like the 50s and the 40s and such. But he could play anything. He really could. And that's why when I go through like his recordings, and he's done everything from jazz to Dixieland to country. In fact, his last 3 top 10 records were country records. One of them was "You're the Reason God Made Oklahoma," which was featured in the movie Any Which Way You Can with Clint Eastwood in 1981.
Huh.
And so, I mean, he could do about anything. Some of the things people don't know, one of the best things he could do was what's called bubblegum pop. He had a knack for knowing what people wanted to hear in that. And you can hear that in the song Dizzy. And then another one people may not know that he played on was Heartbeat Is a Love Beat by the DeFranco family. That's Hal. Now, if you listen to that, that gives you a little idea about his method drumming, too, because he's the heartbeat. He's playing his drums like a heartbeat in them.
Incredible.
If you listen to that, that's what he's doing there.
Well,
and that's the other thing he said when he did like the songs with the Carpenter. He said everything he played, he was trying to think what was in Karen's heart when she was singing that. He said, "I was Karen's heart on the drums."
That's incredible stuff. And I want to thank you because there was...
He did everything for other people, not for himself. Like I said, he was a giver. And he always called himself, he said, "I'm an accompanist. I'm not a soloist." And what is an accompanist? That's a giver. And that's Hal in a nutshell. He was a giver.
I love that. And I want to, I was just going to say, I want to thank you personally because probably I'm in grade 5, I'm in grade 6. I come home every day, get a snack after school, and Three's Company comes on, and there's the wah-wah with those big drum rolls, and I sent you a note. I said, "Was that him?" And you said 100%.
That's another one he was proud of, even though that's not a recording as far as a record recording. But that, you asked me what about his favorites. That's another one right there. What he did on Three's Company. And every year they would re-record it. Joe Raposa would come from New York, and he would come to Los Angeles, and they'd re-record that every year. And every year he would tell Hal, "More drums, more drums." So as you go along in the seasons, there's more drums. And Hal was very, very proud of doing that theme song for that show.
Fantastic. Okay, Ingrid, I want to thank you for doing this. It's nice to meet you in person, I guess, kind of. I've had some chats. I'm totally enjoying that group. I go on there every day to get a new tidbit of information. Just for my listeners and my viewers that are on there, where do they go to find your page?
Well, it's under, if you just search Hal Blaine. Now, there's about 3 different Hal Blaine pages, but this one has like a black and white picture, on it, and currently we have about 14,700 members.
Yeah, it's a big page.
So and it's growing all the time.
Ingrid Fasching, thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you for having me anytime. Just give me a call.
Oh, I'm sure there'll be a part two once people hear some of this. And I've been telling everybody about this site. It's just in a social media world of yuck, it's nice to see something that's fun, right? So thanks again, and you have a great day.
Thank you. You too. You take care.
Bye for now.